Special thanks to Wade Tyler for today's review, and now we're doing the follow-up to Batman Returns. You might be thinking that it might be Batman Forever, and you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but what if you wanted Michael Keaton instead of Val Kilmer and George Clooney? The thing is that we all know Joel Schumacher took over from Tim Burton, and made two lesser received sequels, and I decided to watch Batman Forever and Batman and Robin for this occasion, since those were the original two sequels to Batman Returns. I think it's important for the comparison, and I will certainly do so when going through the comics. Recently, DC started doing comic book continuations of some of the famous legacy content from their catalogue of characters. We've got continuations of stuff like Batman 66, Superman 78, and Wonder Woman 77, which are basically all meant to imagine what happened to certain iterations of characters after their respective shows/movies ended. I do know Adam West commonly reprised his role as Batman up until his death in 2017. However, a lower budget comic book sequel isn't a bad idea. This tactic could continue a lot of incomplete stories. I recall Terminator Salvation, the final battle is what happened after Terminator Salvation, and wrapped up that incomplete storyline. It was there for people who really wanted to know what happened next, given that timeline was canned in favor of Terminator Genesis. Anyways, Batman 89 is envisioned as a sequel to Batman Returns, but with Michael Keaton in the lead role, as well as all relevant actors reprising their roles, or probably using their likenesses at the very least since this is a comic book. Something like this is what they probably should have done instead of relying on the multiverse like Marvel, making an alternate sequel to Batman Returns with Michael Keaton, even if it was 30 or so years later. The comic we're going to look at is more so a year after the events of Batman Returns though. I should also mention that this sequel in particular isn't just some random writer's imagination for what happened after Batman Returns if Michael Keaton reprised his role, because the comic was written by Hamm, who was behind the story of both Batman 89 the movie and Batman Returns. And if you know anything about me, I'd say the authenticity is certainly there. Hamm probably had a lot of time to think about what could have been had he continued writing the series. So this is as faithful as it ever gets, believe it or not. The comic does more naturally follow up the events of Batman Returns than Forever does, although it is worth noting that they did replace a lot of the actors at the end of the day. I've also read, at least according to Wikipedia, that these comics were met to critical acclaim, so it may actually be a worthy contender to Batman Forever, despite the fact that I presume that Batman Forever does have its fans. Anyways, without further ado, I think we should get into the comics. We'll be talking about the original arc, titled Shadows, which is a 6-part story. You'll see right off the bat that they took a cue from Batman Forever and made Harvey Dent turn Two-Face the main villain, although obviously he's not the bad guy yet. Instead of being played by Tommy Lee Jones though, it's Billy D. Williams. Works every time. Oh, you knew I was going to make that joke. Basically, in issue 1, it's established that he's engaged to Commissioner Gordon's daughter Barbara, which is obviously a huge deviation from the Schumacher films, because in Batman and Robin, that iteration of Barbara was established as Alfred Pennyworth's niece, which is obviously a deviation from the comics. They stick to the traditional source material here while also continuing Batman Returns. It's Halloween night in Gotham, and taking the timeline into effect, I'm gonna guess that this takes place the year after Batman Returns. You see, I've written a timeline here. Batman Returns takes place in December of presumably 1992, and this comic takes place on Halloween, but since it's supposed to pick up from Batman Returns, I'm going to guess it's Halloween of 1993. That's just speculation though, and we have no way of knowing for sure until there's a specific timeline laid. I've also heard that the Flash movie doesn't take the comics into account as well, so it's various different continuities. However, if you know me, the purest of timelines in regards to authenticity is absolutely the Batman 89 comics, like it or not. Anyways, with it being Halloween, people are dressing up in various costumes, Batman being one of the most popular. But with that, there's also criminals following in the Joker's footsteps, and we get a cameo from Prince himself, based on how he appeared in the Batman '89 music videos. I remember I made a remark in my Batman '89 film review that I almost imagined Jack Napier collaborated with an in-universe prince to make music for him while he did his evil schemes, such as raiding the museum and vandalizing it. As Harvey Dent proposes to Barbara, criminals nearby intend to start looting with Joker attire, and Batman shows up to ruin their day. Harvey himself gets involved, as when two criminals try to mug him, he proceeds to beat the crap out of one with his watch and scare the other one off. However, unlike his more neutral status in the original film, Harvey Dent is against vigilantes in the streets of Gotham. Case in point, Batman. We see the following morning, after Bruce Wayne has somewhat recovered from the damage dealing with the criminals last night, Harvey Dent comes to see him and expresses to Bruce his distaste towards Batman. Yeah, Harvey Dent believes Batman is just a hit squad that Commissioner Gordon made up. Whenever there's trouble, Gordon just gets a specially trained ninja to deal with criminals, whether it be the Joker or the Penguin. We know that Bruce Wayne is Batman, so of course, Bruce doesn't agree with anything Dent says. There's an exchange between Bruce and Alfred once Dent leaves that Alfred believes that Harvey might have a point, although Bruce states how he won't turn on Commissioner Gordon, as Gordon was in fact the cop on duty the night his parents were killed. This is a somewhat interesting place to take the story following Batman Returns actually, showing that Batman inspires a lot of copycats. I remember there was something like that in The Dark Knight, but not much other than that. Here, the whole opening threat revolves around this. After a scene of Harvey Dent meeting up with his childhood mentor Jerome Otis, we get a scene of Harvey Dent publicly denouncing Batman, condemning the reliance on him, and calling for a vote of no confidence in Commissioner James Gordon. Soon after this, the bat signal goes up, and Bruce Wayne, having watched Harvey's trash talk on television, knows full well that the bat signal is most likely a trap, and proceeds to the police station with full caution. What he sees is unsurprising. Harvey Dent, another man Bullock, and a team of snipers. Batman contacts Gordon, and Gordon advises Batman to stay off the streets for a while, informing him the National Guard has orders to hunt him down, before breaking his communicator in dramatic fashion. So during the active manhunt, Batman spots a man chasing a hooded thief, and intercepts the thief, although it's a guy who stole supplies to help his infant sister. And this is where Batman meets another vigilante just like him, who lures him out the window and attacks him, and by the time the issue ends, Batman is confronted by the National Guard. I realized right here that some shit was gonna go down, which means the cliffhanger was effective. I can also say the next issue picks up very quickly, as Batman tries to throw a stun bomb to escape, but the young thief comes out in all the commotion, and the National Guard end up firing in his direction to try and take down Batman, which of course ends up killing the young man. And he escapes when he realizes nothing more he can do. When Bruce Wayne arrives back, the news is already talking about the manslaughter, and Bruce is distraught over what just happened. You can see in the intro to Chapter 2 that he fully blames himself for the kid's death, and in the meantime, we see who the vigilante who attacked Batman was. It's a black kid named Drake Winston, who works at Jerome's repair shop. I noticed here that they're making everything interconnected with all the characters since both Bruce Wayne and Drake Winston know Harvey Dent personally in some regard. I wouldn't complain that it's a small universe, because the fact that Jack Napier, for example, happened to be the one who killed Bruce Wayne's parents and became the biggest menace in the first movie is something that's done to make a more connected story, so I'm not criticizing anything here. I could tell that Drake Winston is supposed to be an alternative to Chris O'Donnell as Dick Grayson, or Robin in other words. Thinking back to Batman Forever, it did pretty much take until the climax of the movie for Robin to become a proper part of the story. I think Joel Schumacher introduced way too many characters in the two sequels than he had time for. Batman and Robin had a godforsaken 3 villains, just like Spider-Man 3, and Batgirl, and overall had so many characters. It wasn't even funny, despite how many puns and jokes there were in general. The approach they go with here is a definite improvement. Drake Winston is basically a street kid whose first scene in action is when Harvey Dent gives another speech in favor of his cause. Drake walks off from boredom and adopts his Robin persona, more or less, when a bunch of criminals wearing Batman merchandise try breaking into a store to steal a bootleg PlayStation. to where Drake beats the shit out of them and walks off, witnesses remarking about him being like Robin Hood. Anyways, we get a scene afterwards of Bruce Wayne contemplating being Batman. Now, I remember when I made it public that I was doing Batman 89, some people pointed out how the comics are definitely not something that would have been written in 1995. That's not a bad thing on its own, but the comics are clearly written with a modern day mentality. We get a lot of nutjobs these days who claim Batman is a villain because he beats up the mentally ill, which is utterly stupid in context. I started to notice reading this comic, however, that there's elements of the whole anti-Batman agenda in these comics. And if there's anything you can say about the Schumacher films, it's that they don't have it. In fact, I noticed that these comics aren't as visually creative as any of the Batman films in the series. They harker a lot with what Batman 89 and Batman Returns had, but it's nowhere near as visually appealing as Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, which I think had a lot of thought put into their designs, regardless of the story quality of the films themselves. Visually, I think these comics play it too safe, and I think that's a shame since the original screenwriter, after all, had decades to think about what he would have done differently from Joel Schumacher. I do have a suspicion that maybe there was corporate interference from Warner Brothers, but that's just a theory, plausible as it might be. Whatever the case, I feel the comics are not innovative enough to fully justify itself as Batman 3 with Michael Keaton returning to the role that isn't the goddamn Flash. Anyways, afterwards, Harvey Dent has a falling out with Bullock, who is furious at him, calling him a two-faced bastard, but of course Dent just shrugs him off, and we get a bit of a switcheroo, where we see Bruce Wayne waiting in Dent's office to tell him that he has an idea. Then cutting straight to the criminals Drake beat up, with one of them who avoided physical harm stating that he followed the kid home, setting up what happens next. Bruce Wayne and Dent go to Otis's repair shop, and Bruce Wayne states that in spite of what happened with the young kid, he's offering to pay for education for every kid in Burnside, where Otis's shop is. And I'm guessing this is the black community area of Gotham. Bruce talks about how he lost his own parents to gun violence and offers to help, which does seem like an in-character thing for Bruce to do, although it does come with the anti-Batman vibe I established earlier. I also thought Batman mentioning gun violence by name was a bit preachy if that's the right word. I don't know. Thinking back to Jack Napier killing his parents in the original film, or even Batman Forever, the emphasis was always on the fact that they were murdered by a psychopath turned main villain, and how Bruce Wayne became Batman in the first place. No emphasis was placed on how guns themselves are bad. Now, obviously, I think guns should be regulated, of course, but I also think that most people in America who own guns are not going to homicide their neighbors. It's mostly because mentally ill wackos get their hands on guns and kill someone with it. I imagine most gun owners just go to the local shooting range to practice because it's fun, you know? Or something harmless like that. Maybe I'm just misreading it, but given this came out in 2021, I thought I'd bring it up. Anyways, Bruce, as he's about to drive home, overhears someone starting a fire where he just left, and both he and Harvey Dent rush over, where Bruce Wayne puts on a ski mask and finds out that Selina Kyle is alive, when he finds the thugs in an alleyway, all clawed up by Catwoman. Bruce Wayne expresses surprise over Catwoman still being alive, although I'm gonna guess that since Batman Returns, there have been numerous Catwoman sightings, although maybe they weren't confirmed, so I imagine Bruce didn't know for sure. Although it is confirmed later that he didn't know for sure until then. Anyways, what you'd probably expect. She distracts him by stating that she needs a kiss. Meanwhile, Harvey, who is also attracted to the fire, speaks to Mr. Otis, who panics and says that Drake is on the top floor, and they pull a page out of Spider-Man 2's book by having Harvey Dent, feeling heroic with no powers, rush in to save him, and cue the cliffhanger to issue 3. So in issue 3, Harvey Dent completely imagines the scenario where he came out and saved Drake with both of them unscathed, to where he's hailed a national hero and becomes governor in a year. Except it turns out this fantasy was just a glimmer of what could have been, as instead, Harvey Dent finds himself waking up, being dragged out, and finding half his face burnt off. And you know who saves him? Both Bruce Wayne and Drake Winston.
Ironic.
And as you might have guessed, it's now Harvey Dent's descent into villainy due to this tragedy. Harvey Dent, with half of his face burnt off, is driven away in an ambulance. With that, Bruce Wayne is instead the one having cameras in his face, being praised as a hero. And since this is right after his encounter with Catwoman, he overhears the suspects being found in an alleyway nearby, with him looking up with Catwoman waving at him. In fact, when Bruce Wayne comes home, he sees that there's news vans absolutely everywhere, waiting to interview him, being the new local hero, with Alfred even advising that he take an alternate way in. With that being said, we also see Drake and Otis dealing with the aftermath of the fire. We get some characterization, as he says when suggested, that he's fine with Bruce Wayne getting sole credit in the newspaper, and he blames himself, since the thugs were after him. He even directly tells Otis this, although obviously not that he's a vigilante fighting crime on the streets. Then we get a joke scene that exists for humor's sake, which kinda feels out of place, where Bruce Wayne imagines last night where Catwoman kissed him, but then wakes up to reality, where Selina's cat is licking him. He looks at the newspaper too, seeing that he's on the front page, where the editor literally just used the picture where there's a flash in his face and he's trying to cover himself. After Alfred asks about the cat Bruce adopted now that Selina Kyle's alive, cut to the next scene, where the suspects now have a lawyer defending them, pointing out that there are no witnesses, at least none that aren't people like Batman and Catwoman, which I can appreciate, because it kind of shows how hard it can be to contain crime sometimes. From the reader's lens, we know these guys are guilty, but just like in the real world, they still have the right to an attorney. But the problem is, lawyers will defend whoever pays them, so the wealthy can get really good lawyers. I suppose this does play into Batman's fight against crime, and why characters like Catwoman oppose his methods. Anyways, we see that Bruce Wayne meanwhile is talking to a guy at the hospital to get proper care for Harvey Dent. Bruce Wayne, being a billionaire, tells Barbara that they all need Harvey Dent, doing what he does best. And this is where we see Harvey himself hallucinating the side of him that was able to escape the fire unscathed. The other side of him shows him a timeline where a car back in his youth hit him instead of his mother, and most of his life was cut short. Or the timeline where he went out drinking and got arrested, missing college and law school, and instead spending time in and out of prison. And in the timeline where he came out unscathed by the fire and now running for governor. The other side comes across as visibly taunty in this panel. And this whole thing inevitably leads to Harvey's descent into becoming Two-Face. In a brief interaction between him and Barbara, he ends up adjusting his two-headed coin so that there is a possibility it can go wrong. Anyways, that night, Batman gets an invitation from Catwoman, with various clues, based on a Shrek paper. Speaking of which, they don't really go into the aftermath of Max Shrek's death. We can all assume his son took over the business, but any further exploration doesn't happen. This story mostly focuses on Two-Face as the villain, Catwoman, and the newly introduced Drake Winston as Robin. And let me remind you, we already had Two-Face as the villain in Batman Forever, and Dick Grayson became Robin. It doesn't seem like that much of a departure from the Schumacher films, since they're treading familiar ground. Billy D. Williams as Two-Face doesn't seem all that different from Tommy Lee Jones. I guess as a comic book, you have to interpret somewhat how Williams would play the role differently, but even imagining Lando Calrissian being Two-Face, it doesn't seem that different from the Batman Forever version. In fact, I would argue the main difference between the two is that we spend a lot of time before Harvey becomes Two-Face, while Batman Forever gets straight to the point with a brief explanation, which unironically I prefer, because Batman Forever did have a lot of characters they wanted to introduce, with a full dedicated subplot to Dick Grayson before he and Batman actually fully worked together. I'm just saying that Forever used its screen time more wisely. Even thinking back to the first two films, the main villains were introduced rather quickly. Both the Joker and the Penguin were introduced in the first stage of the movie, and they both descended into the role of main villain rather quickly. You can see Forever and Batman and Robin had a similar format, that they dedicate a lot of time to the transformation of Harvey Dent becoming Two-Face. That by the time he does his first villainous act, it happens on page 8 of issue 4 out of 6. Yes, I counted. And each issue has around 20 pages. So if we do the math, that means that Two-Face's first villainous act happens at the 56% mark of the whole miniseries. So Two-Face doesn't leave as much of an impression as his Batman Forever counterpart. Anyways, Batman meets up with Catwoman, and after kissing again, the two devolve into arguing about the way they conduct themselves. And what do you know? There's another goddamn fire. With the television in Harvey's hospital room stating that the arsonists were released on bail, and there's a massive protest against that, as Harvey Dent paid dearly. But when the reporter says that Dent was fighting for the soul of Gotham, Dent flips his coin and arrives at tails, and decides it's to hell with Gotham, ending issue 3. So with issue 4, there's a protest in support of Harvey Dent, with hundreds of people rallied against the criminals, and Bullock of the Gotham Police intends to quell the protesters, even when Commissioner Gordon tries to order the opposite, to where Bullock promptly ignores him, so Drake Winston as Robin proceeds to drop spray cans everywhere, and the protesters use it against the cops. Shortly after this event, Bruce Wayne and Alfred figure out that Drake Winston is a vigilante too, and we see Harvey Dent further deteriorate, and thanks to his delusion from earlier, he ends up flipping his coin on everything, and Barbara starts to become worried about him, as we see later that Harvey does his first questionable act, assaulting a hospital worker, and you can see that Two-Face is truly born. We see that Bruce Wayne has acquired Winston Motors, and Drake is brought to the Wayne Manor, and in their first proper conversation, Drake at this point knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman, and accuses him of beating up the thugs who committed arson on the motor place. And even when Bruce clarifies that it was actually Catwoman, Drake doesn't believe him, stating that Catwoman is an urban legend. Then Drake bluffs, stating that he's got a vial of battery acid, the same stuff that burnt half of Harvey Dent's face, and gets Bruce to demonstrate his kung fu skills, although this acid just turns out to be water.
Got him!
Point is, the two know their mutual secret identities, and this is what I'll basically call the comics version of the Batman and Robin team up from Forever. Again, thinking back to Batman Forever, it's definitely a more mature version of Batman Forever, but I think it plays things too safe. The main noticeable difference is that Robin in this story is black, and plays a lot into the African-American subculture of Gotham or whatever. I remember watching Batman Forever, and thinking about how it took a while for the team up to happen, and the same is present here. It's halfway through issue 4 of 6. The story here is over the halfway point, and it's taking basically the same amount of time, story structure wise. And I have to say, as annoying as Dick Grayson was at times, he was more interesting and entertaining than Drake Winston. It's a comic book and not a movie, I know, but the comic book should have the advantage, shouldn't it? It's made by the original screenwriter, he had decades to think about it, and you have the mistakes of the Schumacher-verse to reflect on. And I'm kinda left disappointed. Too similar and too safe is how I describe it, even if it tries to have the aesthetic of the first two films. Anyway, Selena Kyle in her previous Meek appearance openly pretends to help Barbara with a computer virus, and meanwhile, Two-Face is stealing information from the police station, before he whacks one of the cops and makes a run for it, ending up in a subway station, and deciding his base of operations will be in this general area. Meanwhile, they set up Batman and Robin with Bruce taking Drake to the Batcave, and as the end teases, this is their proper team up, and that's issue 4. Again, I found this kind of safe. Two-Face is the villain, as there's been 2 live-action incarnations of the character by the time this comic was written, and we've got Batman and Robin teaming up, except this time Robin is a black dude, and from what I hear, they've also teased Batgirl, as Barbara Gordon makes an appearance here, much like her counterpart from Batman and Robin. How we got to this point too, is not some radical never-seen-before departure from Batman Forever. It's basically what you might expect. You can make Bruce Wayne and Batman use the likeness of Michael Keaton, but there isn't something super exciting or original. To sell this as the 3rd Tim Burton Batman film in comic book form. This comic started off somewhat promising with the callbacks and Billy D. Williams as Two-Face instead of Tommy Lee Jones, but as the comic has gone on, it might just be better to watch Batman Forever. As much as it pains me to say, this comic feels unnecessary. And maybe they should have just made a 3rd Batman film with Tim Burton and Michael Keaton 30 years later. There have been depictions of Batman as an old man, on the brink of retirement and whatnot, so I think the idea is absolutely there, instead of what they did in The Flash. So anyways, Two-Face has a criminal working with police tied up, and because through the threat of death, gets him to rally other criminals inspired by the actions of the late Joker to essentially cause chaos in Gotham. In the background, you've got a dude who looks like, oh wait, that is Lawrence from the original film. If you don't remember, Lawrence was the boombox guy who played the music while Joker, Bob, and everyone else was vandalizing the museum. Last we saw of him, he failed to kill Batman in the cathedral and presumably fell to his death. Although it's established that he fell without any serious injuries, and is here now, working for Two-Face. Anyways, Barbara Gordon goes to speak to her dad, who announces that he's finally resigning. And Barbara discovers a message from Harvey, telling her to meet him at a park. Meanwhile, Batman and Robin get involved with Two-Face and his Joker goons who demolish part of the subway station near the Gotham police station. Throughout all of this, Harvey Dent sneaks into the evidence room, while Batman survives an ambush to the top of the building with the bat signal lit. And Robin, meanwhile, is beating up the criminals outside. Eventually, both former Commissioner Gordon and Batman confront Two-Face. Although Two-Face is able to use a stolen batarang to misdirect Batman to where he accidentally shoots Gordon with a sleep dart and flat out forces Batman into a dilemma where he has to let Two-Face and his goons off or Gordon dies. And Batman of course goes for the hard but honorable path. Just like when Bob threatened to clip Gordon in the original film, Batman complies with the bad guy's demands. And I imagine just like last time, Batman feels like he owes Gordon due to the fact that he was the officer on duty the night his parents were murdered. So he carries the unconscious Bullock out of the building, and the police think he did this. Although when Batman lowers Bullock and opts to surrender, Robin shows up speeding past everyone on the Bat bike, and Batman hitches a ride. Robin having already dealt with a lot of other criminals. So even though Two-Face got away, Batman is able to track the signal through the dart he accidentally hit Gordon with. Although Two-Face and the kidnapped Gordon are probably still underground, so it'll be a while until they resurface, meaning that Two-Face can do whatever while the dart is being tracked. We see meanwhile that Two-Face has Gordon as his hostage, and the coin tells him to let him live. That's where Two-Face decides to meet Barbara at the park, and Batman and Robin go over to the park to apprehend the lunatic. Turns out that Catwoman had the exact same idea. So when Barbara opts to arrest Harvey, a convenient ambush from Catwoman from above allows Two-Face to escape. Two-Face goes back to his hideout, and Gordon goads him into killing him. And Two-Face does so. But when Gordon points out that his daughter will never forgive him for this, Two-Face has a mental breakdown like you've never seen before. And that's where Batman shows up, dark and menacing, ready to end this. Ending issue 5. I do like how the dark side of Two-Face tries to tell his other half that nothing matters, even though he killed his partner's father, but Batman responds in said menacing appearance with, "It matters to me." So at the very least, the cliffhanger is effective. Two-Face cannot come back to being Harvey Dent, as he just murdered his loved one's father, something which will be utterly unforgivable in her eyes. I guess this is also a departure from Forever that I think matters. That former Commissioner Gordon has been killed off. I recall in the 2 Schumacher films, he survived to the very end, played by the same actor even, with the only other one being Alfred Pennyworth. Anyways, the comic does pick up a little bit with this, and I can say it's a genuine surprise. I guess the main reason is that Commissioner Gordon naturally stayed alive in the Schumacher films, and I expected the same to be true of these comics, but I realized that they're giving Barbara Gordon an introduction and an arc, so that's why they're killing him off, to eventually shape Barbara into Batgirl. It makes sense with what happens in issue 5. So yeah, Batman confronts Two-Face, and Batman does offer to help the delusional district attorney, but this obviously never works, so Two-Face tries to escape, only to be caught by Batman, but Two-Face has a backup plan, and he grabs out a detonator, pushes the button, and the top of the subway station collapses on top of Batman. Catwoman and Robin come in, tracking the pair through the subway, and Two-Face finds out who Batman is, as half of Batman's mask was torn in the explosion. Two-Face manages to take a picture with his camera before he flees, and both Robin and Catwoman discover Batman unconscious, and their first thought is to bring him back to Alfred. Alfred in particular has a line when the three arrive back, asking if Selina wants her cat back. Bruce Wayne later wakes up with Catwoman by the side in his bedroom, and Bruce Wayne of course gets out of bed, and Catwoman catches him up to speed. Harvey Dent has a briefcase full of money from a heist by a Joker gang, and he knows who he really is. So Bruce Wayne and Selina have another personal conversation. Selina is insistent that they should just run the city, but Bruce is still hardened with his morals, and asks her that it's been a year. He wasn't sure whether she was alive or dead, and then questions if she ever wants to be normal again. Meanwhile, in the television room, Drake also informs Bruce that they found former Commissioner Gordon's body, and it's being reported on television. We see Two-Face, meanwhile, presumably in the city hall, demanding to everyone there that they get the charges against him dropped, and Carmine Falcone openly questions him, so with the flip of a coin, Two-Face execute him, stating that it will benefit the people of Gotham. He then heads over to Mr. Otis and finds out that he's been rejected by him due to his recent actions, and so Two-Face flips a coin and murders him. Just as Drake comes by, sees the dead Mr. Otis and Two-Face, and the lunatic ends up running out of the building, yelling that Drake shot Mr. Otis, and while Drake gets a solid punch on him, the people nearby swarm Drake, and Two-Face gets away. However, he ends up going straight to the Batcave, telling Bruce Wayne ahead of time that he's coming, and he wants an audience. So yeah, in the end, Two-Face tries to blackmail Bruce Wayne, knowing he is Batman. But Bruce Wayne offers him something. He won't comply with Two-Face's demands, but on the other side of the coin, he could live in the world where he was working with Batman all along, helping him take down the mob and dirty politicians. But he got his face burnt when he got too close. Harvey Dent then gets his face fixed, go through months of therapy, and then they clean up the city for good, the right way. And Two-Face, of course, is hesitant. And as Bruce says, why not let the coin decide? And Two-Face agrees, so he flips the coin. But just like Batman Returns, Catwoman completely ruins the day by detaching the big coin in the Batcave that Bruce Wayne acquired earlier in the story, making Two-Face fall off, and despite Bruce Wayne trying to get him to hold on to a cable, Two-Face seems to return to Harvey Dent in his final moments. He says that he sees a path where they did everything right, Barbara forgives him, and everything is right in the world, before the cable snaps and he falls to his death. Bruce is absolutely distraught, and asks Catwoman why she just killed him, although Catwoman states that he was too dangerous to be left alive. But Bruce counters that he could have saved him, and her. So Catwoman outright lashes at him, telling him that he's an entitled rich boy, and if he had to earn an income and work a job, Batman wouldn't exist. So she ends up stating that she wants her cat back, and she's leaving him, forever, and he can keep the collar. And Bruce Wayne realizes he made a mistake telling Alfred not to interfere at all, and that the collar, as it turns out, had a microphone. Selina knew what they were up to the whole time. So basically, to wrap up the story, Bruce Wayne bails Drake out of prison after providing Harvey Dent's gun to the authorities, and the two shake on it, and part ways as Drake says that he's got an older sister who can take care of the orphaned girl from earlier. And Barbara gets a package from Catwoman containing a picture of Bruce Wayne exposed as Batman, and offers her a chance to take down Gotham's elite. The story closes with Bruce Wayne daydreaming about what could have been before waking up, and ultimately deciding to flip a coin whether to go out or not, ending the story. And that's the Shadows storyline. So, my overall thoughts. This story was okay. I wouldn't say passably okay or mediocre, just okay. My main problems come down to this not feeling like a new Tim Burton Batman movie that just released in the theater after many decades. It's not as dramatic as that. It is a sequel, but I also felt that this story wasn't definitive or standalone enough. What I mean by that is that with the ending of Barbara finding out who Batman is, they were obviously setting up for sequels, and I think this should have been a first-hand standalone sequel that could possibly rival Batman Forever. Those were my personal expectations, but the story feels more like a decent story that plays it too safe. I don't know. Thinking about Batman Forever and even Batman and Robin, they were cheesy, but extremely memorable. I really liked Jim Carrey as the Riddler, and thought even the replacement that was Tommy Lee Jones was pretty good too. The villains might have been the best part of the Schumacher duology, as I also found Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze memorable too, as many cheesy puns as they had. Billy D. Williams as Two-Face feels like it comes too late, while Forever got straight to the point, I feel, with a backstory coming later. The Shadow storyline would never be adapted into a film back in the day, and I'm not just talking about the fact that this was written from a modern day lens. I mean the basic structure of the story would not pass. Critics and probably Warner Brothers executives probably would have complained that it took too long for the main villain to be established. That being Two-Face. Tim Burton and Joel Schumacher got straight to the point with the villains. And while I can understand the point that they wanted to show the transformation of Harvey Dent, I feel like a 6-issue miniseries is too short for that kind of thing. I've also been told that the African American portion of the story is filled with language that wasn't common at the time. And I personally imagine they would have gone with a Caucasian Dick Grayson no matter what. Drake Winston was simply a fine character. I thought Catwoman and her story was better than most of the other subplots, and having a definitive moment where she rejects Bruce Wayne for good, or at least I hope, was effective. The only thing I felt was missing was the aftermath of what happened to Chip, given he presumably inherited his father's business, but Shrek is only referenced in passing. As for Bruce Wayne / Batman, I can certainly imagine Michael Keaton saying all the lines he did in this comic, although I'm not sure he could have been as memorable. The dialogue is not the best, and I kind of just skimmed over it. I remember when I was reading Star Wars Republic and Star Wars Legacy, the dialogue drew me in. The artwork, after all, was top notch, and in Batman 89, the artwork is good, but not great. And I wish we had something as good as the Dark Horse Star Wars comics from the 2000s. Even though this was written by the original screenwriter, I'm going to guess that he had to deal with a lot of restrictions, or he tried too hard to write Batman for a modern audience, instead of taking us back to what could have been an alternate 1995. The 90s were not like the 2020s, and now I've got a soft spot for Batman Forever, especially after reading this. It is worth noting that Joel Schumacher was far from a bad filmmaker. Prior to Batman, he had a good film resume, and looking back on Batman and Robin, he didn't blame anyone else for the failure, stating that he was there, and he was just as involved as anyone else. He had humility. Still though, I think the comics are an interesting thought experiment, but not interesting enough for what we could have gotten in the mid-90s. It has too much of today in it, even though this is a story that takes place in 1993 presumably, given the Batman 89 timeline. So I'll give Batman 89 Shadows a 6.5 out of 10. Not exactly a remarkable sequel, but far from terrible. So with that being said, I would like to thank Wade Tyler for this review. And I'm sorry if my opinion didn't exactly match your own, but it's my honest review. We've been talking about the direct sequel miniseries titled Echoes, as well as the novel coming out from author John Jackson Miller, who did a bunch of Star Wars novels too called Batman Resurrection. So even if I don't get to the Joel Schumacher films eventually, I imagine we'll still get a lot from this series potentially. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain.